Open social. Open source has clearly won. Yes, there are plenty of closed source products and businesses, but the shared infrastructure, the commons, runs on open source. We might take this for granted, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion 35 years ago. There were powerful forces that wanted open source to lose. Some believed in the open source model, but didn't think it could ever compete with closed source. Many categories of tools only existed as closed source. A Microsoft CEO called open source cancer, a decade before Microsoft has rebuilt its empire around it. The open source movement may not have lived up to the ideals of free software, but it won an industry adoption. Nobody gets fired for choosing open source these days, and for much crucial software, open source is now the default. I believe we are at a similar juncture with social apps as we have been with open source 35 years ago. There's a new movement on the block. I like to call it open social. There are competing visions for what open social should be like, and I think the app protocol created by Bluesky is the most convincing take on it so far. It's not perfect, and it's a work in progress, but there's nothing I know quite like it. Disclosure: I used to work at Bluesky on the Bluesky client app. I wasn't involved with the protocol design. I am a fan, and this post is my attempt to explain why. In this post, I'll explain the ideas of the app protocol, lovingly called AppProto, and how it changes the relationship between the user, the developer, and the product. I don't expect AppProto and its ecosystem, known as the Atmosphere, to win hearts overnight. Like open source, it might take a few decades to become ubiquitous. By explaining these ideas here, I'm hoping to slightly nudge this timeline. Despite the grip of today's social media companies, I believe open social will eventually seem inevitable in retrospect, just like open source does now. Good things can happen. All it takes is years of sustained effort by a community of stubborn enthusiasts. So what is it all about? What open source did for our code, open social does for our data. Part 1. Before social. The web is a beautiful invention. You type alice.com and you end up on Alice's website. You type bob.com and you end up on Bob's website. In a sense, your browser is a portal to a million different worlds, each with its own little jurisdiction. Only Alice decides what appears on Alice's website, and only Bob decides what appears on Bob's website. They meaningfully own their own data. This doesn't mean that they're isolated. On the contrary, Alice can embed Bob's picture with an image tag, and Bob can link to Alice's page with an A tag. Alice and Bob can link to each other, but they remain in charge of their sites. But what do I mean by saying that Alice and Bob are in charge of their own sites? Well, even if they're not physically hosting their content on their computers, they could always change their hosting. For example, if Alice's hosting provider starts deleting her pages or injecting ads into them, Alice can simply point alice.com at another computer. The visitors won't need to know. This is important. Hosting providers have no real leverage over Alice and Bob. If a hosting provider turns evil and starts messing with your site, you can simply walk away and host it elsewhere, as long as you have a backup. You're not going to lose your traffic. All existing links will seamlessly resolve to their new destination. If Alice changes her hosting, Bob won't need to update any links to Alice's website. Alice's site will keep working as if nothing had happened. At worst, a DNS change might make it inaccessible for a few hours, but then the web will be repaired. Imagine how different the incentives would be if links were tied to physical hosts. If changing a hosting provider caused Alice to lose her traffic, she would think many times before changing providers. Perhaps she'd stick with her existing provider, even if it starts messing with her site, as losing her connections is even worse. Luckily, web's decentralized design avoids this. Because it's easy to walk away, hosting providers are forced to compete, and hosting is now a commodity. I think the web is a beautiful idea. It links decentralized islands, controlled by different people and companies, into one interconnected surface that anyone can index and navigate. Links describe a relationship between logical documents rather than physical servers, and as a result, you're not a hostage to your hosting. As a wise person said, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So what's been happening with the web? Part 2. Closed social. In the early 90s, the main way to publish something on the web was to have your own website. Today, most people publish content by using a social media app. Alice and Bob are still publishing things, but instead of publishing them at domains such as alice.com and bob.com, they publish at usernames such as @Alice and @Bob, allocated by a social media company. The things they publish are not HTML pages, but app-specific entities such as profiles, posts, likes, comments, and so on. These entities are usually stored in a database on the social company's servers. The most typical way to visualize a database is a sequence of rows, but we could also visualize it as a graph, which makes it look very similar to the web itself. So what does this social graph enable that a web of personal sites doesn't? The advantage of storing app-specific entities, such as posts and likes, instead of HTML documents should be obvious. App-specific entities have a richer structure. You can always turn them into HTML documents later, but you can also query them, aggregate them, sort them, filter them, and recombine them in different ways before that. And this allows you to create many projections of the same data, such as a profile page, a list of posts, or an individual post with comments. Where this really shines, though, is when many people use the same social app. Since everyone's public content is now in a single database, it is easy to aggregate across content published by many people, which enables social features such as global search, notifications, feeds, personalized algorithms, shared moderation, and so on. It is specifically the social aggregation that blows the personal sites paradigm out of the water. People are social creatures, and we want to congregate in shared spaces. We don't just want to visit each other's sites, we want to hang out together, and social apps provide the shared infrastructure. Social aggregation features, such as feeds, notifications, and search, are non-negotiable in modern social products. Today, the most common way to implement these features is shaped like this. There still exists a logical model of our data, our profiles, our posts, our likes, and so on, but they live within a social apps database. And what's exposed to the web are just projections of that model, such as the home screen, the notification screen, the HTML pages for individual posts. This architecture makes sense. It is the easiest way to evolve the personal sites paradigm to support aggregation, so it's not a surprise that today's social apps have mostly converged on it. People create accounts on social apps, which lets those apps build aggregated features, which entices more people to sign up for those apps. However, something got lost in the process. The web we're actually creating, our posts, our likes, our comments, is no longer meaningfully ours. Even though much of what we're creating is public, it is not a part of the open web. And we can't change our hosting provider because we're now one step removed from how the internet actually works. We and the web we create have become rows in somebody else's database. This creates an imbalance. When Alice used to post her stuff at alice.com, she was not tied to any particular hosting provider. If she were unhappy with her choice, she knew that she could move to another provider without losing any of her traffic or breaking any links. That kept the hosting providers in check. But now that Alice publishes her stuff on a social media platform, she can no longer walk away without losing something. If she signs up to another social media platform, she'll be forced to start from scratch, even if she wants to retain her connections. There is no way for Alice to sever a relationship with a particular app without ripping herself and everything that she created through it out of its social graph. The web Alice created, who she follows, what she posted, what she has liked, is trapped in a box that's owned by somebody else. To leave is to leave it behind. On an individual level, it might not be a huge deal. Alice can rebuild her social presence connection by connection somewhere else, and with time she might even have the same reach as on the previous platform. However, collectively, the net effect is that platforms, at first gradually and then suddenly, turn their backs on the users. If you can't leave without losing something important, the platform has no incentives to respect you as a user. Maybe the app gets squeezed by investors, and every third post is an ad. Maybe the app gets bought by a conglomerate that wanted to get rid of the competition and is now on life support. Maybe it ran out of funding and your content goes down in 2 days. Maybe the founders got acqui-hired, an exciting new chapter. Or maybe the app was just bought by some guy and now is slowly getting cooked by the algorithm. If your next platform doesn't respect you, you might try to leave it too. But what are you going to do? Will you export your data? What will you do with that lonely shard of a social graph? You can upload it somewhere as an archive, but it's ripped out of its social context, a pitiful memento of your self-imposed exile. Those megabytes of JSON that you got on your way out are dead data. It's like a branch torn apart from its tree. It doesn't belong anywhere. To give a new life to our data, we have to all collectively export it and then collectively import it into some next agreed-upon social app, a near impossible feat of coordination. And even then, the network effects are so strong that most people would soon find their way right back. You can't leave a social app without leaving behind the web that you've created. But what if you could keep it? Part 3. Open Social. Alice and Bob are still using social apps. Those apps don't look much different from today's social apps. You could hardly tell that something has changed. Something has changed though. Can you spot it? Notice that Alice's handle is now alice.com. It is not allocated by a social media company, but it is the universal internet handle, that is, a domain. Alice owns the alice.com domain, so she can use it as a handle on any open social app. On most open social apps, she goes by alice.com, but for others she wants a distinct disconnected identity, so she also owns another domain she would rather not share. Bob owns a domain too, even though he's not technical. He doesn't even know what a domain is, he just thinks of bob.com as his internet handle. Some open social apps will give you a free subdomain on registration, just like Gmail gives everyone a free Gmail address, or offer a flow for buying one. You're not locked into your first choice, and you can always swap it out to a different domain later. Your internet handle being something that you actually own is the most user-visible aspect of open social apps. However, the much bigger difference is invisible to the user. When you previously saw Alice's social graph, it was trapped inside a social apps database. That's why there was a box around it. It was not a part of the open web. However, with Open Social, Alice's data, her profile, her posts, her likes, are stored on the web itself. In addition to having a personal site, Alice now has a personal repository with her data. A personal repository is a regular web server that implements the AT protocol specification. The only job of Alice's personal repository is to serve and store data created by Alice in the form of signed JSON. Alice is technical, so she likes to sometimes explore her repository using open source tools, such as PDSLS, Taproot, or a Prado browser. Bob, however, isn't technical. He doesn't even know what a repository is. He just got a repository behind the scenes when he signed up for his first open social app. His repository stores only his data from all the open social apps that he uses. Now let's take a close look at this picture. These aren't rows in somebody's database. This is a web of hyperlinked JSON. Just like every HTML page has an HTTP URI so that other HTML pages can link to it, every JSON record in a repository has an add URI so that other JSON records can link to it. So how does this web of JSON work in practice? Note that Alice follows Bob, which means that Alice has a follow record in her repository that links to Bob's profile record, which lives in Bob's repository. Now let's say that Bob left a comment on Alice's post. That means that Bob has a comment record in Bob's repository that links to Alice's post record in Alice's repository. And now let's say that Alice liked Bob's comment. That means that Alice has a like record in her repository that links to Bob's comment record in Bob's repository. Note how everything that Alice creates stays in her repository under her control, and everything that Bob creates stays in his repository under his control, and links express the connections, just like in HTML. All of this happens behind the scenes and is invisible to a non-technical user. The user doesn't need to think about where their data is stored until it matters, just like the user doesn't think about how servers work when navigating the web. Alice's and Bob's repositories could be hosted on the same machine, but they could also be hosted by different companies or communities. Maybe Alice is self-hosting her repository, while Bob just uses whichever hosting came with his first open social app. Their servers could even be running completely different implementations. If both servers speak the AT protocol, they can participate in this open web of JSON. Note that http alice.com and @alice.com don't have to resolve to the same server. This is intentional, so that having a nice handle like alice.com doesn't force Alice to actually host her own data, to mess with her website, or even to have a website at all. If she owns alice.com, she can point at alice.com at any server. This means that if Alice is unhappy with her repository hosting, she can pack up and leave, which requires a modicum of technical skill today, but is getting more accessible. Just like moving a personal site, changing where her repo is being served from doesn't require cooperation from the previous host, and it also doesn't disrupt her ability to log into any apps, and it doesn't break any links. The web repairs itself. It is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate just what we have here. Every public bit of data that Alice and Bob have created, their posts, their comments, their likes, their scrabbles, their recipes, is meaningfully owned by them. It is not in a database subject to some CEO's whims, but it is hosted directly on the open web itself, with the ability to walk away without losing any traffic or breaking any links. Like the web of personal sites, this model is literally centered around the user. So what does it mean for apps? Each OpenSocial app acts like a CMS, a content management system, for a subset of data that lives in its users' repositories. In that sense, your personal repository serves a role similar to a Google account or a Dropbox folder or a Git repository, with data from different OpenSocial apps that you use grouped under different subfolders. When you make a post on Bluesky, the Bluesky app puts that post into a folder in your repo. When you start a project on Tangled, Tangled also puts the star into your repo. When you create a publication on Leaflet, Leaflet puts it into your repo. You get the idea. Over time, your repository becomes a collection of data from different OpenSocial apps. For example, if you wanted to look at all my Bluesky posts, or Tangled stars, or Leaflet publications, you wouldn't need to hit these applications' APIs. You could just hit my personal repository and enumerate all of its records. To avoid naming collisions, the data in the repository is grouped by the format. In any user's repo, Bluesky posts go with other Bluesky posts, Leaflet publications go with other Leaflet publications, Tangled stars go with other Tangled stars, and so on. Each data format is controlled and evolved by the developers of the relevant application. I've drawn a dotted line to separate them, but perhaps this is misleading. Since data from different OpenSocial apps lives together, there's a much lower barrier for OpenSocial apps to piggyback on each other's data. In a way, it starts to feel like a connected multiverse of apps, with data from one app bleeding into other apps. When I signed up for Tangled, I chose to use my existing Dan Abramov handle. But what's more interesting is that it was able to pre-fill my avatar based on my Bluesky profile. It didn't need to hit the Bluesky API to do that, it could just read my profile record from my repository. Every OpenSocial app can choose to piggyback on data from other OpenSocial apps. This might remind you of Gravatar, but it works for every piece of data. There is no API to hit, no integrations to build, nothing to get locked out of. Every app's public data is already in the user's repository, so every other app can just parse it as typed JSON and use it. The protocol is the API. This has deep implications on the lifecycle of products. If a product gets shut down, its data doesn't disappear, it stays in the user's repositories. Someone can build a replacement and make this data come back to life. Someone can build a new product that incorporates some of that data, or lets the users choose what to import. You can even build a new projection of the existing data, a forked product. This also reduces the cold start problem for the new apps. If the data you want already exists on the network, you can just use it. For example, if you're starting a new short video app, you can reuse the Bluesky follow records to bootstrap the social graph. But if it doesn't make sense for your app, you can have your own follow records or offer a one-time import. All existing data is up for reusing and remixing. Some OpenSocial apps are explicitly based around this kind of remixing. For example, Anisoto is primarily a Bluesky client, but it natively supports showing leaflet documents. PopFeed can cross-post reviews to both Bluesky and Leaflet. This is why I like OpenSocial as a term. OpenSocial frees up our data, just like open source has freed up our code. OpenSocial ensures that all data can get a new life, that people can't be locked out of the web they created, and that products can be forked and remixed. You don't need an everything app when data from different products can circulate in a shared open web. If you're technical, by now you might have a burning question. How the hell does aggregation work? Since every user's records are in that user's repository, there could potentially be millions or even billions of repositories. How can an app efficiently query, sort, filter, and aggregate information from them? Surely it can't do that on demand. I've previously used CMS as an analogy. For example, a blogging app could write posts directly to your repository and then read them directly from your repository when somebody visits your blog. This single-player use case would not require aggregation at all. Now let's optimize it a little bit. To avoid hitting the user repository every time the blog is displayed, we could have a database, and we could connect by a WebSocket to the user's personal repository. Every time a user creates, updates, or deletes a record in their repository that is relevant to our app, in this case a blog, we would be notified and update the application's database. Note that with this architecture, the database is not the source of truth for the user's data, it's just an app-specific cache that lets us avoid going to the user's repository every time we need to read it. Coincidentally, this is the same exact mechanism that we need to support aggregation. We can just listen to all events from all of our users' repositories and write the records we're interested in to our app's database, and then we can query that database anytime with zero extra latency. To avoid opening a million WebSocket connections from your backend, it makes sense to listen to a single stream that retransmits events from all known repositories on the network. You can then filter down the stream just to the events that your app is interested in, and then update the local database in response to those events. For example, Leaflet, which is a blogging app, is normally only interested in listening to the pop.leaflet events, which concern Leaflet records. However, if Leaflet wanted to add a feature that shows backlinks from Leaflet posts to Bluesky discussions about those posts, you could simply start listening to the app.bsky records as well, and track them this way. Here you can see a combined event stream from every known repository in the network. It is currently dominated by Bluesky records because Bluesky is the most used app, but you could filter it down to other record types. This particular retransmitter, called the relay, is operated by the Bluesky company, but other people could run their own relays too. For example, the BlackSky community runs their own relay. It doesn't matter which app uses which relay, everyone sees the same shared web. An important detail is that all commits are cryptographically signed, so you don't need to trust a relay or a cache of network data. You can always verify that records haven't been tampered with and that each commit is legitimate. This is why AT in the AT protocol stands for Authenticated Transfer. You're supposed to pronounce it as AT though, and not AT, so don't embarrass me. As time goes by, we'll see more infrastructure created around and for OpenSocial apps. Graze lets you build custom algorithmic feeds. Quick Slice and Tab simplify indexing the network. Constellation and Slingshot let you query backlinks and cached records. These are all technical details though. What matters is the big picture. Part 4. The big picture. The pre-social web of personal sites got a few things right: data ownership, hosting independence, and linking. Alice and Bob fully participate in the web. The closed social web has innovated in scaling and in social aggregation features. Notifications, feeds, and search are non-negotiable in modern social products. However, the closed social web has also excluded us from the web. The web we create is no longer meaningfully ours. We're just rows in somebody else's database. OpenSocial frees the web we're creating from somebody else's boxes. Our profiles, our posts, our likes, our recipes, our scrobbles, all of our content meaningfully belongs to us. Our data no longer lives inside the products. Instead, the products aggregate over our data. This blurs the boundaries between apps. Every open social app can use, remix, link to, and refund data created by any other open social app. The web we've created remains long after the products we've created it with are gone. All data can be recontextualized. No one can take it away. As more products are built in the open social paradigm, there's going to be a shift. People might not start using technical terms like decentralization, but they do notice when data from one app can flow seamlessly into other apps. People might not care about federation, but they do understand when they log into a competing product and their data is already there and their reach is still intact. And people do understand when they're being fucked with. For a long time, OpenSocial will continue to rely on a community of stubborn enthusiasts who see the promise of the new approach and who are willing to bear the pains of building and failing in a new ecosystem. But I don't think that dooms the effort. That's the history of every community-driven change. Somebody has to work through the kinks. Like with open source, OpenSocial is a compounding effort. Every mildly successful OpenSocial app lifts all OpenSocial apps. Every piece of shared infrastructure can benefit somebody else. At some point, open is bound to win. I just hope it doesn't take 35 years.